Welcome back to our study of 1 Samuel. So far, we've covered chapter 1, and we actually bring a decent bit from chapter 1 into us when we approach chapter 2, which is what we're going to be studying today. In chapter 1, we meet the initial main character of the story, this woman, Hannah, and we learn about her story. She is barren. She wants a son. She asks God for a son, and she is given a son. And this is in the context of her rival, Peninnah, who has plenty of children and always makes fun of Hannah for not having any. And so there's a sense of vindication in this story, that Hannah's faith is rewarded and vindicated by virtue of the fact that God gives her what she asked. We also realize that this is about more than just one person, that there is also a sense in which Hannah is functioning as a symbol for Israel. Her fortunes are not great, but then God restores them. And that will be the people of Israel during this time. Their fortunes are not great, but the hope is that God would restore them. Hannah, for her part, demonstrated real faith in Yahweh in asking and receiving the gift and then giving it back just as she promised. And we wonder, will Israel exhibit the same faith that we've seen from Hannah? We also saw one more thing in the context of chapter 1 that we want to be mindful of, and that is, whereas Hannah was, of course, a wonderful character, we had very subtle, but at the same time real, indications that we may be dealing with weak leadership. We don't know much, and I don't want to overjudge from one detail, but it's pretty concerning to us that you have this faithful woman who is praying to the Lord, and the priest Eli actually mistakes her prayers for drunkenness. And so we bring some of these things with us, not super developed ideas, just more hints and clues about where we're going, and we pick up the story in chapter 2. Chapter 2 very much is a very continuative of what's in chapter 1 because we begin with Hannah singing. So I want to begin by reading out Hannah's song, or as it's called in the text, Hannah's prayer, making a few comments about what we see in her prayer, and then we'll read through the rest of the chapter and see how these things connect. Chapter 2, verse 1. Then Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one beside you. There's no rock like our God. Do not keep talking so proudly, or let your mouth speak such arrogance, for the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. The bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for food, but those who were hungry are hungry no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has had many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. On them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful servants, but the wicked will be silenced in the place of darkness. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be broken. The Most High will thunder from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed." Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest. And so the first portion of what we see here in chapter 2 is indeed Hannah's song. Now, it is perhaps best described as a psalm because it is a song that is also a prayer. Hannah prays to the Lord. And we see some important things in this prayer. Essentially, the main idea of the prayer seems to be, God has done great things for me, and what God has done for me, God will do for us. This really is in keeping with the way in which songs function. Songs tend to interpret what's going on around you in the Bible. So occasionally, as you're reading through the Old Testament story, someone will just break out in song. It usually has something to do with what's been done, and it usually has something to do with what's to come. So they sort of function as these hinges in certain ways, and certainly that's the case here. She is celebrating what God has just done, and in her celebration are some hints and clues announcing what will come in the future. And the primary emphasis of this idea that God will do for us, Israel, what God has done for her, Hannah, is that you're looking at a reversal of fortunes. There's very much a topsy-turviness to what happens in this song. So those who are in power should be very careful lest in their arrogance they be thrown down. Those who are provoking should be very careful lest they end up eating their words. Whereas those who are at the bottom of the rungs should look forward to the fact that God has promised to bring them high. And so you really have a reversal of fortunes in which, though Israel may find herself in a difficult situation, she will be blessed like Hannah and end up in a better one. There also is a sense in which when you look at what God has done for Hannah and will do for Israel, you are both glancing back in the story and looking ahead in the story. There are some fascinating parallels to other moments in Israel's history. Let me just show you a couple. One of the things that's interesting is to note the parallel between her psalm and what we find back in the book of Exodus. So in chapter 2, verse 2 of 1 Samuel, Hannah prays, "There's no one holy like the Lord. There's no one beside you. There's no rock like our God." And back in Exodus chapter 15, Miriam, who is, of course, celebrating God's delivery of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, prays, who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders?" And so in the same way that Miriam was led to pray and celebrate the fact that God is the only one like him, Hannah prays and celebrates the fact that God is the only one like him. More recently, you have back in the book of Judges a prayer from Deborah, who was the one who stepped up to lead God's people at a time of need. And she says in her prayer, this is Judges chapter 5, verse 4, "When you, Lord, went out from Seir, when you marched from the land of Edom, the earth shook, the heavens poured, the clouds poured down water. The mountains quaked before the Lord, the one of Sinai, before the Lord, the God of Israel." And then, of course, Hannah prays here in ours, "It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be broken. The Most High will thunder from heaven." There's that language of cosmic upheaval. "The Lord will judge the ends of the earth." And so there's a sense in which this song recalls not only God's deliverance of Hannah, but God's deliverance of God's people again and again. And of course, once more looks forward to what's to come. However, I want to think about this with you. If the kind of main thesis of the prayer is that God will do for us what God has done for me, you have to kind of find out which characters correspond to which. And so if we're talking about this rivalry between Hannah and Peninnah, and there is some corresponding person or group of persons who is at the top, currently in position of power, but taking on this power with a measure of arrogance that is about to be judged by God, you have to wonder, who are we talking about? This means bad news for somebody. So is this bad news for the Philistines? Well, yeah, but first you have some other folks who probably need to be removed. I want to continue reading now in chapter 2, verse 12, and we'll find out precisely who she was singing about, at least in the most immediate sense. It says, "Eli's sons were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was the practice of the priests that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a three-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was being boiled, and would plunge the fork into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the person who was sacrificing, 'Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw.' This is not the way it's supposed to go. The priests, of course, are supposed to facilitate the sacrifice, making sure that the proper portions of the animal were devoted to the Lord, and then they would take some portion for their own, and then some of the animal would be given to the worshiper so that they might have a festival celebrating Yahweh's action in their life. That's not what takes place here. Let's keep reading. If the person said to him, 'Let the fat be burned first, and then take whatever you want,' the servant would answer, 'No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force.' This sin of the young man was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. But Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, 'May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord.' Then they would go home. And the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. Now back to Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So he said to them, 'Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, the report I hear spreading among the Lord's people is not good. If one person sins against another, God may mediate for the offender, but if anyone sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him?' His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. And the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with people." Let's pause to comment on what we see. We are now no longer looking at Hannah's psalm, but instead we are looking at Eli's sons. Eli is the one who has been appointed as priest before the Lord, and things are not going well. His sons are corrupt priests. This is about the priesthood not accomplishing the purposes for which God originally designed it. The job of the priest is fairly simple: to serve as a mediator between God and the people. And so you serve God on behalf of the people, and you serve the people on behalf of God. That's the job. You are a go-between. You have responsibilities to the people over which you lead, and you have responsibilities to the God who leads over you. And what we see in this particular case is that it is precisely in these ways that they have corrupted the idea of the priesthood pretty thoroughly. So the sacrifices, first of all. The sacrifices are brought by the people, and the priests are supposed to facilitate this. It is a way for the person either to express gratitude or confession to God, and for the person to realize that God has either received their gratitude or offered them atonement by virtue of the sacrifice that has been provided. As I mentioned before, the priests had roles in this, and they were supposed to ensure that the proper portions went to the Lord, and then there was actually some that was given to the priest for food, and the other portions of the animal were given to the worshiper, again, to celebrate in a festival, thanking God for what he had done. They totally messed up the entire process. They took that which belonged to God, and they took that which belonged to the people, a corruption of the priesthood. To make matters worse, we find out in the second panel of description of what we see in them, in this sort of half-hearted, ineffective rebuke that Eli offers his sons, that not only are they abusing the sacrifices, they are abusing the virgins who are there nearby, the worshiping. Now, there's probably the case where these virgins symbolized Israel in her purity, and they were designed to again be this sort of representation of Israel coming up to the Lord. And yet these sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, take advantage of this situation by themselves engaging in intercourse with these priestly virgins. This, once more, is a corruption of the priesthood. And to make matters worse, do you know the name Phinehas? I mean, this man was named for a previous Phinehas who is talked about in Numbers 25 and who is known because out of his zeal for the purity of the Lord's name, he drove a tent peg between two people who were engaging in inappropriate intercourse in defiance of God's holiness. So this Phinehas has fallen far from his namesake. And what we see when we look at these two is, my goodness, that they are doing the opposite of what they are called to do. And yet in both cases, meanwhile, the Lord is growing up Samuel. Meanwhile, Samuel is growing in favor and stature. Well, we're beginning to recognize that Hannah's song was not just about the Philistines. Hannah's song was about Eli and his sons, and pretty soon that will become apparent for us. Let's read the rest of the chapter. Verse 27 says, "Now a man of God came to Eli and said to him, 'This is what the Lord says. Did I not clearly reveal myself to your ancestors' family when they were in Egypt under Pharaoh? I chose your ancestor out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, and to wear an ephod in my presence. I also gave your ancestors' family all the food offerings presented by the Israelites. Why do you scorn my sacrifice and offering that I prescribed for my dwelling? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by the people Israel? Therefore the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that members of your family would minister before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honor me I will honor, but those who despise me will be disdained. The time is coming when I will cut short your strength and the strength of your priestly house, so that no one in it will reach old age. And you will see distress in my dwelling. Although good will be done to Israel, no one in your family line will ever reach old age. Every one of you that I do not cut off from serving at my altar, I will spare only to destroy your sight and sap your strength, and all your descendants will die in the prime of life. And what happens to your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be a sign to you. They will both die on the same day. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and mind. I will firmly establish his priestly house, and they will minister before my anointed one always. Then everyone left in your family line will come and bow down before him for a piece of silver and a loaf of bread and plead, appoint me to some priestly office so I can have food to eat. My goodness, this is an intense message, and it comes from a person who is unnamed but described as a man of God. It is important for the story for you to understand that man of God is not a general description for a godly person. It is in the Old Testament a description for a prophet. This is an unnamed prophet whose job is not precisely the same as the priest, whose job is actually quite simple. In general, it is to speak the words that God has given him, and specifically in a case like this, it is to speak truth to power. We see some interesting things in the message of this prophet. Apparently, Eli himself wasn't so innocent. Apparently, Eli himself really didn't mean the rebuke, or if he meant it, it was a sort of hypocritic kind of thing, because he himself was participating in some of the same things that his son had done. And my goodness, we notice that the punishment seems to fit the crime. Not only the intensity of it, but the very shape of it. They take the food, but they themselves will go hungry. They've been given a task that they've corrupted, and so the task will be ripped away. This is a message that is intense, and it is, of course, related to what happens as the story unfolds. For now, let me just suggest 3 takeaways that might be beneficial for us to meditate on. As again, some of these are specifically for leaders, but all of us do well to notice the truths that we see in this text. First of all, and I'll just state these quickly, first of all, I think part of what we see when we pay attention to what's going on here is that position and power are not reliable signs of God's blessing. This is, of course, an important lesson for us always to hear, because some of us may position ourselves as leaders. Some of us may be positioned by others as leaders, and all of us at some level look to others to lead us. And it is always important for us as we look around and evaluate which voices we'll listen to, which persons we'll trust, which leaders we'll follow. It is important for us to recognize that being in a position of power does not mean that you are a person of faithfulness. And if you're the follower, looking at someone in a position of power does not necessarily mean this is a person whom you should follow. The second takeaway that I think we see here is that legitimate callings from God do not immunize leaders from corruption. I'll be honest with you, as a person who considers myself called by God to engage in certain forms of ministry, this is fairly terrifying to me. Again, we're talking about a legitimate calling. We're not talking about a situation when somebody just decided to do something. We're talking about a family, that of Eli, a line, that of Eli, a house, him and his descendants, who were appointed by God as priests. This was a legitimate calling. But just because they received a legitimate calling, that did not render them immune from corruption of that very calling. And if you find yourself in a position that you believe that God has called you to, or if you're working toward the fulfillment of a calling that you believe that God has placed on your life, my goodness, we should probably consider ourselves warned by this text. I suppose we could specifically draw out the fact that there may be a temptation to arrogance that grows with the duration of our time in power. There's a sense in which we tend to grow in confidence as we grow in time, and that's probably generally speaking appropriate, but apparently not always. Some of you may have been in your current positions for a long time, but you probably ought well do a double take and ask the question of whether the time has actually driven you toward intenser humility or more forms of corruption. The final thing in this specific regard is, I think what we see here in the case of Eli is a blind spot. In his case, it was his sons, and that will continue to happen with leaders in the book of 1 Samuel. But more generally, we could ask again, especially those of you who've been in certain positions for a while, what have you stopped paying attention to? What have you stopped being mindful of? What are the parts of our lives and leadership that we just assume are okay? Because maybe the things that you're assuming okay are the blind spots that could do you in. And thirdly, and finally, I think part of what we have to see when we look at the sad, tragic story of Eli and his sons is that God removes the leader who fails to hold the line. This story, remember, is about God's people moving through a time of transition. And the difficult thing about transition is that, by definition, things are changing. You don't find yourself in the same situation that you were in before. And so some of the ways in which God's people may have managed themselves and led others aren't necessarily going to continue to work in this new context. You find things changing all around you, but the temptation is as things change all around you that you don't stand firm on the things that never change. There's a doctrinal component to this that is important for us, and there's a moral component to this that is necessary for us to hear. And I think what we need to recognize is that good leaders discern the times and they let change what is changeable, but they stand firm on what is not. It is unfortunate to us that leaders who hold the line are rare in 1 Samuel, and it would be foolish of us to assume that something is different, that this is different in our own time. So let's not be the kind of leaders that God has to remove. Let's be the rare leader who stays in the positions that God has called him to, because even as everything changes around us, we hold the line on the things that do not. This is a story about Hannah's song, Eli's sons, and the God who drives them both. There are certain ways in which we may need to find ourselves encouraged, but more than anything, we probably ought to consider ourselves warned.